Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to the 16th Godrej Archives annual lecture. It is indeed an exciting moment for us as we are hosting the annual lecture after a gap of 2 years. And though we opted for online this year, we are really eager to host you all in person at an offline event soon. But right now, we have to be satisfied with the online platforms. But as we are meeting after a gap of 2 years, let me refresh your memories about Godrej Archives. Godrej started mulling over the idea of setting up an archive back in 1997 during the company's centenary celebrations. Late Saurabh Godrej, the then chairman of Godrej Group, envisioned archives to be a heritage center offering invaluable archival material for reference and research. Later, in 2006, with the appointment of a professional archivist, efforts towards promoting record keeping culture within the organization and establishing a process for collecting corporate memory started. With the motto Restore, Reflect, Reimagine, Godrej Archives today helps the organization with collection, storage, and conservation of its historically important records. With total collection of around 2 lakh items, including more than 300 oral history interviews with employees, workers, dealers, designers, engineers, customers, etc., Godrej Archives today offers a valuable resource of business knowledge for academicians and historians. With an aim to generate awareness about the organization's history and the preservation of India's corporate heritage, Godrej Archives engages with its audience regularly through exhibitions, lectures such as these, and workshops, etc. Godrej Archives annual lecture series in one such pioneering initiative of the archives that aims to popularizing business history and encouraging the conversations on business history as well as business archives. I would now request Dr. Firoza Godrej, Chairperson, Godrej Archives Council, and the Museum Society of Mumbai, CSMVS, to say a few words about the lecture series and introduce the speaker. Over to you, Dr. Godrej.
Thank you so much, Brinda. And welcome, Dr. Professor Sassoon. It's a real pleasure to have you with us this evening. And I welcome you on behalf of all of us present at the Godrej Archives, the staff, Brinda Pathare, and her colleagues, Shweta Jadhav. I welcome you on behalf of the chairman of the CSMVS, the trustees, the Director General, Mr. Sabyasachi Mukherjee, the Museum Society, my own committee, friends of the Museum Society, extended friends of the Museum Society. All of us have gathered here today to listen to you, and we've been waiting for this event, and we're waiting for your book to be completed and published. So it gives me really, really great pleasure to have you address us at the 16th Godrej Archive Annual Lecture. It's been more than many years since our last annual lecture in 2019, and we are grateful to the CSMVS who wholeheartedly supported our endeavor to encourage research in India's corporate past since the beginning, that was in 2006. Of course, we miss the lovely lawns and the backdrop of the CSMVS while we are doing this on Zoom, but I know that very soon we will be returning to the offline mode. Nonetheless, we are also thrilled that we have once again back to our annual lecture series on this journey, which has been truly rewarding in many, many aspects. In the year 2006, when Godrej Archives started this annual lecture series to spark off conversations on business history and the need for business archives, we were skeptical if business history will have an audience. This was our first foray into the public arena. Everything we did was on campus and related to the campus and the extended campuses. But we all thought it was a good idea to do something, especially since we came across so many researchers and scholars working in this field. But the wonderful audiences we have today have kept us going every year. And it is with your support and encouragement that we could reach here. It is a much looked forward to event. And we were fortunate to have many distinguished scholars as speakers who helped us introduce unheard of stories, varied aspects of our own business history, and becoming a part of our corporate past. This year, we are fortunate to have amongst us Dr. Joseph Sassoon, who will be delivering this lecture based on his upcoming book. I think it's yet to be released in India. I'll let Brinda do that. Titled The Global Merchants, a story about the enterprise and extravagance of the powerful business family of Sassoons, into inverted commas, the Rothschilds of the East. I think we have a great-great-granddaughter and a great-great-grandniece from this family on the webinar today, joining us from London. Dr. Sassoon is the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and professor of history and political economy at Georgetown University. He holds the Al-Sabha Chair in Politics and Political Economy of the Arab World. He's also a senior associate member at St. Anthony's College, Oxford. In 2013, his book, Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, Inside an Authoritarian Regime, was published by Cambridge University in 2012 and won the prestigious British Kuwait Prize for the best book on the Middle East. Professor Sassoon completed his PhD at St. Anthony's College, Oxford. He has published extensively on Iraq and its economy, and of course, on the Middle East. This book, The Global Merchants, is his fifth book. I now request Dr. Sassoon to divulge the secrets behind the phenomenal success of the Sassoons and reveal the panorama of 130 years of their prominence in India and to the world. Over to you, Dr. Sassoon, and welcome to our lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, sit back and enjoy it. And before I really hand you over, I have to thank our technical team. This is our 92nd, I believe, lecture at the Museum Society since the lockdown. And for this, I'm eternally grateful to Professor Dr. Jason Johns and his team of Mrinalini, Ashwarya, Yashraj, and today supported with the Godrej Archives team. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. And over to you, Dr. Sassoon.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Really appreciated. Thank you to everyone at the Godrej Archives and all the team that has been fantastic. I only wish, as you pointed out, to be with you in person in Mumbai rather than sitting in my desk at Washington, D.C. The book, The Global Merchants, has many facets. The life of a Baghdadi Jewish family, trade and colonialism, family rifts and issues facing dynasties, globalization in the 19th century and what it meant for global traders, Anglicization and the desperate need for immigrant families to be accepted in new homelands, and why some dynasties decline and others continue. I will be focusing today on trade and globalization and business in general. I'm going to share with you some slides. So for several generations, the Sassoon family held a prominent leadership role in Baghdad's 2,500-year-old Jewish community because of their connection to the rulers of the Ottoman Empire. In 1781, the son of the family, Sheikh Saleh bin Sassoon, born in 1750, was also the president of the Jewish community in Baghdad, became the chief treasurer for the province. And Baghdad at the time was a flourishing gateway city, and one of Sheikh Saleh's duties was collecting taxes for the Sultan in Istanbul. Conflicts with the Wali in Baghdad led to his abrupt departure from the city with his family in late 1829. It is not correct that he left because of a pogrom or anti-Semitism. In fact, his siblings stayed behind. Sheikh Saleh died in exile in the Persian Gulf port of Bushehr in Iran a year later. So who is the founder? After the death of Sheikh Saleh, his eldest son, David Sassoon, born 1792, became head of the family. He moved to Bombay sometime in early 1832 after learning of commercial opportunities in British colonies. With no experience in trading, David benefited from two intangible assets: the family's extensive contacts in the Gulf and Persia as a result of their treasury role, and their good reputation among the merchant families in the Ottoman Empire. His knowledge of local economies and their languages, his reliable Jewish relatives and correspondence in several trading centers that were staffed by employees brought in from Baghdad, and his firm reputation made his business one of the largest in India a couple of decades later. Family for David the founder was of immense importance. His first wife died at a young age in Baghdad after bearing him two sons and two daughters. His second wife, who outlived him, gave birth to 6 sons and 4 daughters. Small army at the end of it, if you think about it. The sons were trained in business from their youth and were later sent to different locations, such as Baghdad and the Gulf ports, to meet other traders, gain experience, and learn Arabic. David realized at an early stage that the fate and success of the family had to be tied to the British Empire, and the firm of David Sassoon and Sons began a long connection serving British colonial economic and political interests in the different locations where they had branched out. Although he neither set foot in Britain nor spoke English, David Sassoon was granted British citizen in recognition of his services to expanding the colonial interests of the British Empire. So let me just, before getting into the business, give you a little bit of a flavor. These are the characters in the book, main characters. 5 main figures successively take center stage. David Sassoon, which I just spoke about, his first son, Abdullah, who later becomes Sir Albert as he moves to England in 1872, changes his name and become, as I said, Sir. His second son, Elias, who built the business in China. Farha, later Flora, the first woman in the family to run the global business. And I argued in the book, in a whole chapter, that she was actually the first CEO in the world at the end of the 19th century. And finally, Sir Victor Sassoon, who presided over the business in its last 25 years. There are, of course, other characters. Suleiman, who is Flora's husband, Sir Philip Sassoon, an art connoisseur and a politician, the famous World War I poet Siegfried Sassoon, and some of the siblings of Abdullah and Elias and their descendants. In 1843-44, Elias, David Sassoon's son, was sent by his father to explore the possibility of expanding into China. After spending time in Canton, Hong Kong, and Shanghai, Elias reported back on the tremendous opportunities in this enormous country. This coincided with the end of the First Opium War, 1839-1842, and the opening of Shanghai to foreigners. In the early 1850s, Elias settled in Shanghai and began reporting daily to his father in Bombay. The year 1858 was an important turning point in the destiny of the family. 2 major events occurred. First, the legalization of opium in China and the dissolution of the British East India Company. The latter followed the unexpected Indian rebellion against the British in 1857, after which the British government took direct control of India, opening free trade to Indians and foreigners. This allowed families such as the Sassoons to capitalize on the vast commercial opportunities in India. The decade 1858-1868 was years of dynamic expansion in the family's trade. The growth was reflected in the wider range of commodities traded, the opening of new branches across India, such as Calcutta, expanding into new ports and cities in Japan and Burma, And finally, the Sassoons began investing in stock markets and insurance companies and became major shareholders in new banks. As members of the family were posted in different countries and ports, a vast correspondence took place on a daily basis between the branches and the brothers. The family seems to have kept every scrap of paper. Their archives stretch for more than 100 years, and they engaged in copious correspondence, both for business and for social matters. This gives you an idea about the kind of tens of thousands of correspondence. Almost all the business correspondence, at least until 1920, was written in this language. It's a Baghdadi Jewish written in Hebrew characters to prevent outsiders from reading their letters. And notice in this, there are no paragraph. All their correspondence jump from one subject to another. It begins very formal, but it moves very quickly to criticism, complaining about different issues. Reputation of the family constantly is repeated as of utmost importance. It ends also very formal, asking, to give the best to members of the family. So let me now, with this little background that I gave you, shift to their trade. Two commodities changed Bombay financially and led to the rise of new global merchants: cotton and opium. Though David Sassoon was not involved in those commodities initially, he monitored closely the trading scene in Bombay. His name is not mentioned in the archives or any local newspapers throughout the 1830s and even the beginning of the 1840s. David Sassoon's rise to be among the top businessmen of Bombay was slow and gradual. There was not a one event or trade that changed the picture radically. He just kept developing a network of local and foreign traders and trustworthy counterparts, and learning not only where the opportunities lie, but also the ins and outs of trade and negotiations. He would, for example, spend days by the cotton exchange talking to traders, agents, and scrutinizing the international news carefully. By the end of this period, the expansion was so huge. Let me just show you how it looks. This is a map where they had expanded, and you could see the vast expansion is around city ports. Three major red dots, stars. These are the major hubs. First, it was Bombay. The second one became Shanghai, and the third became London. Of course, with expansion, tension was created among the different members of the family, and it dictated a new hiring and dealing with employee issues throughout the region. As trade expanded, a major challenge was how to allocate merchandise among the different branches. They called it, by the way, houses: the House of Bombay, the House of Shanghai, the House of Japan, and also how to allocate profit or loss and how to account it among the brothers at the end of each financial year. So turning to cotton, David was convinced to enter the cotton market by witnessing the surge in demand for Indian cotton after the panic caused by the failure of the American crop in late 1850s. Powerful trade circles, such as the Manchester Chamber of Commerce, had recognized that India could displace America as the most important source for this white gold. But until 1850s, high transportation costs made Indian cotton less attractive. The steady increase in Indian production, however, coincided with British imperialist views and the burgeoning role of free trade. The outbreak of American Civil War in 1861 and consequent collapse of American exports of cotton provoked skyrocketing prices and frenzy of speculation. Cotton shipments changed hands many times between speculators before delivered to factories, with each exchange a small profit could be made. The value of cotton more than quadrupled in the first 2 years of the war, pushing Indian peasants to increase their production. There were even rumors that people were tearing apart their mattresses and selling the cotton. Before long, however, there were signs that the market was losing steam and too many traders had too much stock. The explosive growth of cotton in India had been matched in other countries such as Brazil and Egypt, and global oversupply was a major concern. By April 1865, reports circulated that cotton traders were experiencing big losses and steep fall in prices followed. When the war ended, panic spread around the world from Bombay to Liverpool. A year later, reports carried details of a Bombay devastated financially, with estimates of 80% of traders near bankruptcy. As one brother admitted to another, he could not sleep for worry and opined that every member of the family had to be vigilant in order to avoid large losses, since that would damage the most important element in their business, their reputation, which was sacrosanct. The violent swings in cotton prices illustrate how global merchants conducted their business in the mid-19th century without a fast communication system. Although the telegraph was available, it was very expensive and not confidential. The business was set up so each major hub has its own house and each house made independent decisions. The relationship of trust among the branches allowed family members to prosper, but it also, as I mentioned before, led to constant recriminations. It was essential that each house gather accurate information, not only about the market, but what competitors and brokers did or intended to do. Therefore, information was at the core of most merchants' activities. Exacerbating the scarcity of reliable information were the employees or agents working for different merchants were enticed from time to time into selling the information to competitors. Obviously, it was difficult to manage risk from a distance, particularly given the inaccuracy of information and endless stream of rumors about a war that was so far away. Here, the Sassoons had advantages. Sons and sons-in-law of David were scattered, and each reported back to head office in the language that I showed you, which was basically no one could decode it. Also, David was the first of the merchant families in India to send a son to London in the 1850s. This proved to be a critical step, as the son had more information about the Civil War than those in India, which gave the family an advantage. Volatile times needed nerves of steel and experience. What is really remarkable when you look at the business is the young age of most of these sons sent to all corners of Asia to run the business. Elias, the second son, when he was shipped to China, was barely 17. The son running Hong Kong in the 60s was just 24, and the one in Shanghai was 23 years old. Let me now shift to the other commodities that made Bombay, opium. There is no doubt that British imperialism and colonial interests forced China to purchase opium. The Sassoons probably began trading in the mid-1840s and stopped only after the First World War I. Initially, there were small players in comparison to some Indian traders or British firms such as Jardine Matheson, and only later the Sassoon became a significant part of the trade. While opium had been used for thousands of years in India and China, both for medical and recreational use, the British victory in the Anglo-Chinese Opium Wars in the mid-19th century opened the door to the export of large quantities of Indian opium to China. This became an integral part of a triangular trade. British people had been addicted to tea and developed a taste for Chinese silk, but had nothing to export to China in return. Opium filled the gap and for decades made up roughly 15–16% of India's revenue. Opium also became the world's most valuable traded commodity in 1860 and remained so for a quarter of a century. In the words of one Indian scholar, Bombay became a great commercial and industrial center thanks to the opium business. By the 1850s, opium had become an integral part of the family's trading business. The Sassoon adopted to cut opium prices, providing loans to producers in India, making bulk sales at low rates combined with advances to Chinese dealers, and probably most effective, advancing as much as 3/4 of the cost to Indian dealers. The strategy proved to be a profitable one, reducing cost and giving the Sassoon an edge over their competitors, ultimately dislodging Jardine Matheson, thus allowing them to control a large portion of the market by the mid-1870s. Traders, whether of opium or cotton, preferred to deal with the Sassoon because of their willingness to pay up to 50% of the value of the merchandise. There is another point. The family really worked hard to maintain its relationship with its partners and agents. The opium trade began to weaken by the 1890s due to international and regional factors. Opium is a case study of how interrelated business and politics were during the global expansion. Consistent from the beginning, the Sassoons mustered all their connection and political clout with the British government to ensure favorable opium trade terms. Of course, it was intertwined with the British ideology of a free trade and colonial policy. Faced by political agitation by both the House of Commons and House of Lords, the British government did what governments do best when tough decisions need to be made. It formed a commission of inquiry to study the subject in detail, thereby delaying the need for immediate action. In 1893, a royal commission on opium was created with a mandate to study whether the cultivation and sale of poppy should be prohibited except for medical purposes and the cost for Indian cultivators if opium was prohibited. The commission collected incredible amount of data, gathered witness responses from a large array of individuals, including dozens and dozens of medical doctors in many locations. The finished report comprised 7 volumes, a total of 2,500 pages, and it is one of the most prized sources on opium in all its features during the 19th century. In its report, the commission reached the following conclusion, and allow me to quote. As a result of the searching inquiry and upon a deliberate review of the copious evidence submitted to us, we feel bound to express our conviction that the movement in England in favor of active interference on the part of Parliament for the suppression of the opium habit in India has proceeded from an exaggerated impression as to the nature and extent of the evil to be controlled. The gloomy descriptions presented to British audiences of extensive moral and physical degradation by opium have not been accepted by the witnesses representing the people of India, nor by those most responsible for the government of this country. This was an incredible conclusion. Effectively, the Commission's report removed the opium question from the British public agenda for another 15 years, and essentially the view of the government of India prevailed for financial reasons. In spite of the stigma attached to the trade and the growing opposition in the second half of the 19th century, the Sassoons and other traders continued to defend the trade and to attempt to put a halt to any restriction imposed by China. Apart from opium and cotton, other main commodities that the family traded were tea, silk, indigo, rice, and pearls. The Sassoons were very cautious before embarking on trading in a new commodity. They researched the subject thoroughly and analyzed the risk and rewards. The Sassoons did not engage in money lending. They invested in banks around the world to gain information and credit if needed. In the early 1860s, they invested in the Bank of Hindustan and became one of its directors a couple of years later. They invested also in the National Bank of China, and in order to strengthen their relationship with Persian traders, they invested and became on the board of Imperial Bank of Persia. But the bank that lay at the heart of the Sassoon enterprise was the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. And although its headquarters were in Hong Kong, Jardine Matheson was not on the board due to its fierce competition with the Sassoons. The family, of course, was fortunate to have other major factors working in its favor. Global commodity prices began to boom in the second half of the 19th century as industrialization and economic growth were taking place in major economies of the world. The British ideology emphasizing free trade, and from 1864, the impact of the telegraph radically affected global trade, and branches began communicating efficiently the price of commodities. But lastly, the development and transport within and outside India led to a reduction in the cost of trade, and of course, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 reduced the cost and changed the face of competition. By the end of the 1860s, one competitor summed up the situation. Silver and gold, silks, gums and spices, opium and cotton, wool and wheat, whatever moves over sea or land feels the hand or bears the mark of the Sassoon. So now let me turn into a little bit of a more analysis. What were the advantages of the family in global trading? This sums it up. Reputation. David Sassoon always said, reputation, reputation, reputation. You can lose your money many times, but you can lose your reputation only once. Information was and is vital for any trader and business, and they developed a vast network of agents, brokers, and having so many brothers in different locations. The coded language, as I mentioned it, which meant that to decode these letters, one needed 3 languages, the Baghdadi Jewish dialect, Arabic, and Hebrew, and that obviously made it very difficult. Finally, we think we know now all the financial instruments. Well, remarkably, there were arbitrage opportunities, whether in interest rates, silver, or currency traders by the end of 19th century, and Flora was one of the first to start in those trading. Continuing those factors, allying with the British, as I mentioned, they tied their destiny to the strongest empire at the time, and in the long run, mostly it was a good bet. They cultivated senior British officials wherever they were, and that helped them when these officials went back to London. They understood, because of their background, the local cultures. They learned most languages and gave to local charities to enhance their positions. Finally, successful families had to be in the right place at the right time to take advantage of major changes. And the Sassoons did exactly that. Think about it. Opium War, American Civil War, another Opium War, and of course, all the technological advances. So let me move now to something critical in family dynasties, once the first generation establishes its success. Rifts and divisions were causes of a decline in many family businesses throughout history. David Sassoon, the founder, probably did not suspect that after his death, the extensive family business would be divided, and that two firms, each carrying the Sassoon name, would compete head to head across the world until their demise. Although, as I put it in the beginning, the decade 1858-68 epitomized the rise and expansion of the dynasty, other major events during that time created the permanent rift within the family. So David Sassoon dies. Then the two brothers tried to create some system because he allowed Abdullah to inherit the business. In his will, it was very, very clear. But then Elias Sassoon refused and the two family split. But what was at the heart of the rift? Even before that, I argue in the book that there were a lot of other things, conflicts, taking place under the surface that caused this rift. An interesting one is the subject of accounting, led to subtle but sometimes blatant clashes between the brothers. As I said, the family kept a track of all its correspondence, but also had meticulous accounting ledgers detailing every trading transaction. So this is a copy of one of the pages of the ledger. The ledgers are, for example, if there is an opium trade, it shows details, whether it's Malwa, whether it's Patna, number of chests, cost per chest, transportation, insurance, and agency fee. And here comes an innovative aspect of the Sassoon. Every transaction, without exception, whether it's profitable or not, was taxed by 0.25% for charity. And this was really, truly an innovative and a remarkable change. Local Jewish communities, wherever they are, benefited from this act, but so did the poor and young in cities such as Bombay. And of course, we still have today the Sassoon Library, and in Pune, origin, the Sassoon Hospital and other buildings. One of the unique aspects of the family's trading activity was the internal accounting that I said. And why did he create that tension? So it's interesting. I argue that David Sassoon actually pushed every son to become more entrepreneur and thus created tension between the brothers. And I argue that it was kind on purpose because he wanted this, created conflicts, but at the same time, it created a spirit of entrepreneurship and the willingness to take risk separately and not to rely on the larger group and the trader. So considerable documentation underlines the separation in accounting, and it became a key for friction. Branches also criticized each other, handling of affairs. Interestingly, as long as David Sassoon was alive, no one ever criticized him, and the criticism was always directed at some people helping him in Bombay. As I said, it's possible that this tension was intentional to sharpen entrepreneurship and competitive. And the other aspect of a friction as some brothers moved to London is how long can you be stationed? You know, in the beginning, when they lived in different parts of China and Japan, no one complained. But suddenly some brothers moved to London and began to tell them about the good life there. And so that became another issue for friction. And brother writes to another brother, why am I stuck in the middle of China while you're having fun and enjoying English life and its luxuries? So the death of the founder shook the family. There is no doubt. And as I said, his appointment of the elder son was unequivocal. And Elias said, I went to China, I created a lot of business, I'm entitled to 50-50. 3 years, the negotiations to patch, it did not work. And at the end, there was the separation. Of course, Abdullah himself, who stayed in Bombay, rallied his brother, emphasized the need for unity to continue what their father had begun. And I quote, "We are all transient on this earth, but what our compassionate father left us, we must continue. We must be loving and supportive to each other so that we raise our name in the world." The rift between Abdullah and Elias pushed both sides to take more risk and expand. As a consequence of the completion of the canal was a surge in demand for docks in India for the larger ships now entering Bombay on a regular basis. Abdullah was quick to see the opportunity and purchased about 200,000 square foot of land in Colaba at the tip of Bombay Peninsula. In 1874, after 3 years of construction and excavating out of solid rock, the Sassoon docks opened for business, easing the approach to Bombay. By the late 1870s, the docks were enormously profitable and were sold. Both Sassoon companies wanted to enter a new market and expand into new locations. And one could argue that the 2 decades following the rift and the intensified competition created the most successful period for the family. However, the rift also weakened the family in the long run because of so much energy focused on that. There is another reason for divisions within the family. I'm not really going to enter it. It's all the marriages and intermarriages. Let me quickly shift to the decline into the few minutes left. The decline began in the late 19th century, gathered momentum with the Japanese invasion of Shanghai in 1937. The family's wealth declined with every generation due to either lack of business talent or lack of interest in trade. And the demise of the family business is not just a social phenomenon. It is the story of one of the first globalized firms that suffered the consequences of rejecting modernization and the changing times. The rise of the Sassoons came from their ability to adapt to major political and technological changes. And it was their failure to do so afterwards that brought about their decline, as they could not properly assess the political, economic, and social changes. A number of factors led to the demise. First, as I said, by the third generation, building a fortune was no longer the most important priority. Many members of the family chose to have a luxury life. Second, those who were in charge of the business simply did not have the same drive and willingness. And there is a lot of, in the archives, the comparison of what the first generation of David and Abdullah, how hard they worked and for 6 days, and the third and fourth generation barely putting in 3 hours a day in the office, but then going for horse racing. They also began to misinterpret, they really misinterpreted the ability of the communist takeover in China, and as a result, they lost all their assets in Shanghai. And it's very interesting because there are cases in India, such as the Tatas, which advised, to head to industrialization back in the 1870s, but the Sassoon rejected it. And of course, they stayed with opium, which died a natural death by the World War I, and cotton, which became a very cheap commodity, and with entrance of a competition by both China and Japan. Family branched out, considerable fortunes and estates were split and further split with each generation. And without any dynamic revival of the business, the end of the family fortune and power became a foregone conclusion. And with that, I'm going to stop now and take questions